Okay, good morning, everyone, and welcome. My name is Mike Kellum. I am the 2022 chair of the Economic Development Council for Shawnee. I'd like to thank you all for attending our first quarter investor program, and especially give a warm welcome to our neighbors to the south, the Lenexa EDC. On behalf of Ann Smith-Tate, President and CEO of the Shawnee Chamber of Commerce, and Blake Schreck, President and Economic Director of the Lenexa Chamber, both of whom are on this webinar, we thank you for supporting our EDCs. We look forward to today's program. I want to start by thanking our Shawnee 2022 leadership level sponsors, the City of Shawnee, Complete Construction Services, and Johnson County Community College. I'd also like to thank Carol Lehman and her team at Johnson County Community College for sponsoring today's webinar. And at this time, I'll invite Carol to say a few words on behalf of Johnson County Community College and turn it over to her. Carol.
Thanks, Mike. Happy New Year, everyone. I had a little bit of trouble getting on this computer, so excuse my background, but really don't excuse my background because I know we all feel the same way about the Chiefs. Happy New Year from all your friends at JCCC. We had really hoped to be able to be together, but I think safety is the best option, so thanks for that last minute decision. Johnson County Community College is dedicated to transforming lives and strengthening communities through learning. Your JCCC is nationally known for excellence and innovation. Students can choose from undergraduate credit classes, nearly 50 career degree and certificate programs. Our workforce and continuing education branch offers more than 2,600 courses and programs that enhance career development and personal enrichment. Non-credit courses and contract training increase knowledge and skills while boosting job productivity and career potential. And remember, JCCC is for everyone. Just this last fall, we had 53 adults graduate from our GED program and many others who have benefited from English as a second language. We also have training classes for offenders who are looking for a second chance. We are fortunate to still have some CARS funding, and we're happy to pass those dollars on to you. If your company received a PPP loan or idle funds, you are eligible for $25,000 worth of training and education for your employees. Don't pass up this wonderful opportunity to retrain or upgrade your employees in leadership development or supervisory skills, healthcare, IT skills, CDL training, or the trades. Now is really the time to give us the call and grab that $2,500. It is my honor and pleasure today to introduce our featured speaker, Dr. Chris Kuehl. Chris is the managing director of Armada Intelligence. He provides forecasts and strategic guidance for a wide variety of corporate clients around the world. He is also the chief economist for several national and international organizations. Prior to starting Armada in 1999, he was a professor of economics and finance for 15 years, teaching abroad, and holds advanced degrees in economics, Soviet studies, and East Asian studies. I have long been a fan of Chris's, and you will be too. If you have questions for Chris, please ask those in the chat box, and Mike will address them at the end of Chris's talk. With that, welcome, Chris. I'm going to turn this over to you, and we are ready to hear what you have to say.
All right, very good. Well, thank you very much for the opportunity, and I'll get my slides in the proper order here as soon as they let me. There we go. So here we are, 2022, and gee, it feels a lot like 2021. So why wouldn't it? The economy does not really pay a lot of attention to calendars, and even though we try to. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what happened last year, but really focus more on what's about to happen or what we think is about to happen. But I always have to remind people of the differences of opinion as to what economists do and who we are. My friends think I sit around counting piles of money. My mother thought I was some kind of an accountant. Society was convinced that we were soothsayers and we could predict the future, despite years of proving that we can't. And the government thinks I give them an excuse to print money. I think that I explain things in excruciating detail. In reality, we just argue with each other. So the joke has always been that if you put 5 economists in a room, you're going to get 5 different opinions, 6 if one's from Harvard. So we'll kind of go through this and talk about what some of the variations on those themes are, because we are hearing a lot of differences. There are people who are very worried about some issues, and there are people who are not at all worried about the very same issue. So we'll talk about why that's the case. So the latest elephant in the room, and it's something that we were dealing with for 2 years. We are going to be dealing it for another year or 2 or 3 or 4 or whoever. We have another version of the pandemic. We have Omicron now. It probably will not be the last. We all know intrinsically how viruses work. They adapt, they change, they are trying to survive, and they are very, very good at it. We are dealing with viruses today that emerged literally thousands of years ago and will continue to be a problem as we go forward. The economic impact has been far more limited than we saw in 2020. We didn't really know what we were dealing with in 2020. A lot of the responses were kind of made from guesswork. We didn't know how long it was going to last. We didn't know how serious it was going to be. We didn't know very much. And we ended up kind of taking an approach that did far more damage to the economy than we thought it would. And we've spent the better part of the last year trying to recover from that. The markets reacted badly at first. Air travel was badly affected at first. It has already recovered to a degree. Not much discussion anywhere about shutdowns or lockdowns. A little bit more of that in Europe and in parts of Asia, not so much in the US. Still working on the basis of incentives to do things rather than mandates. There are certainly conversations about what should and shouldn't be mandated when it comes to vaccines or protection protocols or any of the others, not likely to be resolved anytime soon if you follow politics. The biggest issue is consumer caution. The consumer began to react pretty early. As soon as they began to hear about the latest variation, there was a considerable amount of retreat. We did not go out to eat as much as we had been. There was a little less travel, though it was hard to tell because the travel season is intense at the end of the year anyway. So it was this year as well, just not quite as intense as we thought it might be. And then we're still discussing various labor issues. What kind of guarantees do we have when it comes to employee safety? You know, what are the mandates as far as vaccine? What are the protocols that can be expected? And it changes, obviously, from industry to industry. I mean, I work a lot with manufacturers, and from the very beginning, the protocols were not applicable to them. I mean, it was like, work remotely. You can do that if you've got a job that is predominantly done on your laptop, and you can do it. But, you know, the manufacturers really frown on employees taking the press breaks home. The laser cutter kind of needs to stay where it is, and you're going to have to go to it in order to work. And so it was from the very beginning a difficult challenge for manufacturers, even to match up with the protocols that were in place, and that will continue to be an issue. It's important to remember that we are still the big dog, and that sometimes gets lost in the shuffle. When we look at the share that each country has of world GDP, we're still a quarter of the world's GDP. We're still roughly twice the size of China. And every time you turn around, there's somebody saying, China's going to catch up. They've been saying that now for 10 years, and they haven't. It's not like we've stopped. You know, we continue to grow. We are continuing to be the dominant economy, and everyone in the world still basically keys off what we do from both an import perspective and export perspective. And I'll talk a little bit about the implications of that in a bit. One thing that was unusual about the 2020 recession is that it was universal. Everyone in the world experienced it pretty much at the same time. And that's rare. Generally, with a recession, you're going to have part of the world experiencing it before the rest does. You're going to have parts of the world that don't experience it at all. If you go back to, for example, 2008, the recession kind of started here. And for almost a year and a half to 2 years, there was conversation that, hey, this isn't affecting China at all. China's not in recession. They eventually got there within about 2 or 3 years, predominantly because we were their consumers. And if we're in a recession, then eventually they were going to be in a recession. But it took 2 years for them to be in the same position we were in. Europe was about a year behind us. So there was always a part of the world that kind of dragged the rest of the world along with it. That didn't happen in 2020. Everybody went down, and everybody went down for the same reason. By the same token, everybody came back in 2021 and at relatively high speeds. There was a point at which in the US, we were growing at 9.6%. We never grow that fast. By the time the second quarter was over, we were down to 6.5, which is only 3 times faster than we normally grow. So an awful lot of the problems that we dealt with in 2021 were problems of growth. And even though they were desperately uncomfortable, and we saw a broken supply chain, we saw labor shortages, we saw inflation, the likes of which we hadn't seen in 30 years, all of that was coming off of growth. It was coming off the fact that we had bounced out of 2020 at an incredible rate. All of us anxious to get back to our old ways. We had money to spend. Carol was beginning the conversation about money that's still available for companies that are recovering from 2020, training money and PPP loans and all the rest. That money and the money that was sent to the individual through the stimulus amounted to the same amount of cash that the Japanese generate in a year. It was the size of the Japanese GDP. We spent $7 trillion in 1 year. That money did not necessarily all go into the economy at the same time. A lot of it didn't show up until 2021, which is partly what drove some of that rapid paced development, which we'll talk about in more detail. So if you look forward, things are looking relatively not benign, but kind of getting back to a pattern of growth that we saw developing really over the last decade. GDP is continuing to grow. Personal consumption expenditures will continue to grow. We're spending differently than we used to. We'll talk about that in a minute too. Most of the other things, gross private investment, net imports and export, those are all sort of staying at an even, they didn't change much, even in the course of this recession. They stayed pretty stable. Most of the activity was in terms of GDP numbers and, of course, how people spent their money. If you look at some of the expectations, and as I said, there's a lot of variation. You're going to find pretty much somebody somewhere who's going to agree with whatever interpretation you feel like adhering to at any given moment. You've got people who are gloom and dooming it to death. You've got people who said, oh man, we're going to be back to normal in about 3 days. And then you're going to have a lot of people in the middle. One of the things that's nice about this particular group, this is the National Association of Business Economists. There are basically 3 kinds of economists in the world. There are those that work for academia. They tend to be the more philosophical, the more ideological. They're talking about bigger trends in the economy, looking at what's happening globally, et cetera. Then you've got the government economists, and they're the people that work for Department of Commerce, the Fed, various agencies at the state level, local level. They tend to be a lot more data driven. They're not so much into interpretation as they are saying, hey, this is what we found. This is what's happening. Here are the numbers. This is how much growth you're getting. This is where it is. This is how many people are being employed. They don't spend a lot of energy on trying to explain it. It's kind of up to you to figure out what that all means. And then you've got the business economists who are really only interested in how it affects their company. They're working for Fortune 500s. They're working for associations. They're working for businesses per se. So when they're looking at data, they're like, okay, what does this mean to retail? I'm the economist for Walmart. I don't really care what's happening with shipbuilding. That's not me. I want to know what's happening with retail. Or somebody says, well, I'm the economist for Ford Motor Company. I want to know what's happening with automotive. And I'm not necessarily losing sleep over multifamily construction, except in an indirect way. If you look at the NABE expectations, the vast majority of them are expecting recovery by the second quarter of this year. So there are a few that are pushing it off a little later than that, but not many. A few perhaps seeing it a little early, but the consensus view from this group looking at their own data is that a lot of that recovery will take place in the second quarter of this year. And I tend to agree with that. Here's what the spending looked like. It was kind of odd for about a year. The surprising development, particularly for the manufacturer, was how well they did in 2020. And this is because the consumer had a lot of money. They just couldn't spend it on what they normally spent it on. The service sector vanished. When the protocols were put in place, the anticipation was they were going to be very short, a few weeks. I remember talking about this in 2020, and the consensus view was May rebound. This is going to last a couple months. You know, by May or June, we're back to normal, and the COVID virus goes away like flu does every year. And what's the big deal? And, you know, we'll be fine. Yeah, by about mid-2020, we knew that wasn't going to happen. And of course, it got progressively worse as the year went on. So the services part of the economy just vanished. Restaurants closed and events closed and programs weren't held and trade shows were canceled or moved. It just, the bottom dropped out. But people had money. They had more money in many cases than they'd had before because the stimulus was trying to keep people from experiencing the recession. So they bought things instead. So throughout that 2020 up to 21 period, you had a lot of purchasing of stuff. And it also played heck with our trade deficit. We ended up importing a lot of stuff too. So then you get into 2021, 2022, it begins to reverse. People are back to spending on services. They're not spending as much on goods. And then by the time you get to the end of this year, early 2023, we're kind of back to that normal pattern that we saw for 20 years prior to this. About the same spending either way, that you're spending on stuff and you're spending on services and everything is back to normal. That's assuming that we don't get some new surprise in there somewhere. But the trend is basically to go back to that norm, which we've seen for the better part of 2 or 3 decades. So one of the things that gets talked a lot about for obvious reasons is inflation. And we're seeing a lot of hyperbole when it comes to inflation, which is kind of typical. We tend to over dramatize things a little bit, and that certainly is the case with economic trends. So a couple of things to stop worrying about while you focus on what there is to worry about. First off, we are not coming anywhere near either hyperinflation or stagflation, even though there are people out there who are claiming that it's right around the corner. My favorite prognosticator in that regard is the founder of Twitter. And I just have to keep pointing out that the first 4 letters of the word Twitter is twit. And I really wish he would stop talking. As mentioned in the introduction, I have a degree in Soviet studies. I intended back in the 80s to be a spook, and I was going to work for the agency and study the evil empire, and I learned Russian, and I was all set. You know, I had a career. And then the SOBs went out of business in the middle of my PhD, so I had to kind of do something else. But I was in countries experiencing hyperinflation. And the way hyperinflation works, you go into a coffee shop and you say, in what was left of Yugoslavia, and say, I'd like a cup of coffee. How much? 500 dinar. All I have is a 100 dinar note. He said, don't worry about it. Make it as big as you want. Just draw in circles. So I converted my 100 dinar note into a 1 million dinar note by drawing in my own circles. And I said, okay, how much can I get now? And he goes, cup of coffee. He says, if you'd come in with the chicken, I could have done something with the chicken. This currency is worthless. It changes value every 10 seconds. It's toilet paper. You know, it means nothing at all. That's hyperinflation. That's 50% levels of inflation per month over several months. We're at a little over 5, getting up on 6. You know, we're not even close to that. Stagflation requires two things. It requires double-digit inflation, which we're not at 6%, and it requires double-digit levels of unemployment. We're at less than 4. We're at 3.9, according to the data from last Friday. So the prediction is next year, closer to 3.8. So we're nowhere near stagflation either. So when people worry about that stuff, it kind of takes their mind off what they should be worrying about, which is real inflation kind of settling in semi-permanently. You know, the transitory part of inflation is commodities driven. Eventually oil prices come down, eventually steel prices come down, lumber prices come down, food prices come down. They always do, and they always go back up. So they're volatile. And if you look at any chart from any length of time, you see it looks like an EKG. It's just up and down and up and down and up and down. It's just the way it goes. The money supply was driving inflation for quite a while because all of that money that was pumped into the economy, not just here, but worldwide, created about $7 trillion in excess savings. Eventually, what happens with that money is that it kind of ensures that people aren't necessarily going to react to inflation right away. They'll notice it, they will complain about it, they will gripe about it, but at the end of the day, they have money, so they go ahead and pay for it anyway. So they look at the price of whatever it is, going, wow, that's outrageous, but I still want the steak. I still want to fill my car up. I still want the product. I still want the service. Yes, I know it's gotten more expensive, but I don't care. At some point, that money evaporates, and we've reached that point. We spent most of that back up in the holiday season. We entered into October, November with about maybe $3.5 to $4 trillion in excess savings. It's all gone now. So we spent it. It was a good holiday, and we all spent our money. Now, all of a sudden, inflation begins to bite, and people will start reacting, not because they don't want the stuff anymore. They just can't afford it. The one that is most worrisome is the one in the middle, wages. What we hope does not happen is that wage price chase, the wage price spiral. Prices go up, people with leverage begin to demand higher wages, and you're seeing this throughout the country right now. So the wages go up, which then the producer has to react to by raising prices again, which then triggers more wage demands, which triggers more price increases, and you end up with this wage price chase. Those who don't have the ability to raise their wages are the ones that get caught because either they don't have the leverage to demand higher wages or they're on fixed income. And they're the ones that are starting to look at this going, this is not good. Not that I begrudge people a little extra money in their paycheck, but I know what happens next. And it's not going to be good for me because I don't have the ability to get my paycheck any bigger. At this point, we're still not seeing a really aggressive wage price chase, but if you look at some of the assessments for the coming year, the Conference Board is predicting that almost 4% of labor costs are going to be tied up in wage increases. Companies that are desperately trying to find labor are having to pay more and more for it. Again, with manufacturing, but the same with construction and transportation. There are so few people coming in new to the industry. The pipeline isn't as robust as we would like it to be. The easiest way, the only way for these companies to continue to grow as far as their labor is concerned is to poach each other. So they're going after each other's employees, and you do that by giving them more money. So you not only are increasing your labor costs, but you're increasing the labor cost of your competitor because they're now going to have to raise the wages of the people they still have so they don't lose them. So you end up with this marching upwards, particularly in areas where there's a shortage of worker. The skilled trades have been in that situation for a while, but now you're getting the professions are doing it. The latest report from the JOLTS survey, Job Opportunity Labor Turnover Survey, is that the quit rate is as high as it has been in 25 years. Something like 4.5 million people just up and quit their jobs. And these are different than people who took a new job. So if you just switched jobs and you went from one to another, that's not a quit. A quit is when you just wake up some morning and say, I can't stand this job anymore. I quit. I'm done. I don't have a new job. I don't have any place to go, but the labor market is so strong, I can find something if I need it. So I just quit. We've never had this many people taking that position. And just recently, the social media sites are talking about the anti-work movement, where people are saying, look, I don't have to get a new job. Not in the traditional sense, I don't. I can work in the gig economy. I can be an Uber driver. I can be a part-time dog walker. I can be a part-time house cleaner. I can do a whole lot of things, and it doesn't require me actually taking a job. And the part that I hated about having a job was having a boss and having hours and having employees I didn't like. I'll just do the gig thing, and I don't have to worry about any of that. And we are much more positioned to support gig work than we've ever been. Finding people to do things for you now is far easier than it used to be. You just go on the internet and say, hey, I need someone to take care of my cats. I need someone to fix a porch. I need a ride to the airport. And some person says, hey, I'll do it. And bingo, you have a transaction. If you look at where inflation is really going to be in the coming year, we're going to start seeing it come down pretty quickly. You've already seen some sectors start to see a decline in pricing, even with all the other stuff going on right now. The core rate of inflation, which is what the Fed pays attention to, and that's inflation minus food cost and energy, because those are the most volatile sectors, that may not start coming down till more mid-second quarter, but the peaks that we're at now are going to be reversing pretty quickly. But notice that it doesn't mean that it goes back to what it was even last year or the year before. We're getting inflation kind of back to where we saw it in 2017, 2018, core rates probably staying a little consistently higher, over 2.5, between 2.5 and 3. Real rates being somewhere in that 3.5 range. Not insignificant. It is still a change for people who've not had to deal with inflation for a very long time, but not ridiculously out of control. Not the sort of thing that's going to cause a lot of economic angst unless we get something that drives these prices back up again. There could be geopolitical issues. There could be all kinds of things, but those are hard to predict. So here's the slide I hope you forget. This is the slide where I just kind of say, here's where I think we're going to be. And with any luck, I won't be like a weatherman trying to explain why I was wrong for the next 3 weeks. The GDP growth, I think, will be under 5%, probably between 4 and 4.5% next year. It's going to start off a little bit slower than we thought it might, and maybe pick up speed more in the third, fourth quarter. Inflation at the core rate will be around 3, about a point higher than it has traditionally been. The real rate will be closer to 5, again, about a point and a half higher than usual. Interest rates will start to rise by the middle of 2022. The consensus view now is that there'll be at least 3 rate increases starting in March, which could put us anywhere between 0.75 if they are quarter point increases. It could put us at maybe 1.5 if they're half point increases. The one thing to pay attention to as far as the Fed is concerned is the group that makes this decision is the Open Market Committee. The Open Market Committee is made up of the Board of Governors plus 4 regional Fed presidents that serve 1-year terms. These guys and women have extremely influential roles because they're sort of the eyes and ears of the Fed in the hinterlands. It matters where they stand when it comes to this issue. This year, the 4 who've been on the Open Market Committee have either been doves or at least neutral when it comes to rates. Starting this month, the new group that comes in is much more hawkish. It includes our very own Fed chair. So we are going to have our contribution from the Kansas City Fed. We're going to have Loretta Mester from the Cleveland Fed. When you look at these two women, they're by far the most hawkish regional Fed presidents. Esther George has been a true disciple of her predecessor and has been very aggressive when it comes to rates, at least as she's talked about them. Loretta Mester was the head of research under Charles Plosser at the Philadelphia Fed, also very hawkish. The Boston Fed is going to be represented, and that used to be a very hawkish gentleman who'd been with the bank for, I think, 50 years, Eric Rosengren. He has now resigned a little early, but will likely be replaced by another hawk. And then that leaves Jim Bullard from the St. Louis Fed, who can run hot or cold. What's interesting about Bullard is that his head of research, Chris Waller, is the newest member of the Board of Governors. And Chris Waller has traditionally been a little more hawkish. End of story is that you'll have 4 regional Fed presidents that are probably going to trend hawkish. 2 of them for sure, the other 2 more than likely. And that sort of reinforces the notion that rates are going to go up. Mortgage rates will rise at the same time, not ridiculously. We're not talking about rates that are going to prohibit the market from growing, but they're going to be 3.8, 3.9, 4.1, not brutal, but it's certainly going to price some people out of the market, particularly with housing prices what they have been. That house price increase hasn't had a big impact on the housing market because mortgage rates have been low. But when the mortgage rates start to go up, that pricing issue becomes more germane. The unemployment numbers will vary. We're probably going to see U3 below 4%. U6 is still going to stay a little closer to 9%. And the difference between these two, U3 is one of the 6 cuts that come out of the Bureau of Labor Statistics. It's the easiest one to collect because it's literally just the people who are formally on unemployment. U6 is going to include 2 groups of workers that U3 doesn't. The discouraged worker, the person who's not getting unemployment help but is just as unemployed, and the involuntary part-time, the person who would rather be working a full-time job but is only working part-time. That number has gone fairly high in the last couple of years because you've had a lot of people who've sort of out-expended their support from unemployment, and you've had a lot of people who've gone to that part-time role. That number has been consistently about twice what the U3 number has been. Workforce participation is still going to stay low, predominantly because of retirement. You've heard a lot of conversation. People don't want to work anymore and they don't want to do that. Well, that's not really that true. The reason the unemployment rate and the workforce participation rate has been so low, boomers are retiring. We retire at a rate of 10,000 a day, and that's been going on for several years. We've lost something like 4.5 million people from the workforce just as the boomers started getting into retirement age, and that's going to keep going on for another 4 or 5 years. So add into that the number of women who can't get back into the workforce because they're not sure what to do about childcare. You probably saw in the news that the Chicago Teachers Union has decided to demand that all the classes be done remotely rather than in person. Instantaneously, according to the numbers up there, something like 1.5 million women quit their jobs. They had to. It's like kids are coming home. You know, they have gone back to work. Kids have gone back to school. Kids are back home. They now have to do the remote learning thing again. They now have to take care of their kids again. 1.5 million women quit their jobs that day. So you're running into still the impact of the pandemic. A lot of reasons to make the education remote. There's a lot of safety concerns, all the rest of it, but it has an impact on the economy as well. And people who are relying on school to essentially handle their children for a period of time can't rely on that anymore. As I mentioned, the trade deficit got worse because we bought a lot more stuff from overseas, but at the same time, our exports have been doing fairly well. So we're not losing ground in terms of exporting. We still export. Something like 86% of everything we export to the rest of the world is manufactured goods, and it is 15% of our economy. And it doesn't sound like a lot, 15% of GDP, but that amounts to something like $7 trillion. So $7 trillion comes into this economy every year from what we sell from the manufacturing sector. That which is not manufacturing is predominantly agriculture. So that's what makes Kansas like the #6 export state in the country. People are always surprised at that. They're like, well, how can we be an export country? Well, we grow a lot of food, and as hard as we try, we've not been able to eat it all. And as a result, we sell it. So mentioned that some of the inflationary tactics or drivers were beginning to change. We're starting to see maritime rates come down. Transportation rates in general are starting to come down. That's one of the pieces of good news about the supply chain. Still a lot of supply chain issues, but it's beginning to ease because the shipping season is over. You know, the retailers have done their thing, and now it's a catch-up period. The oil market remains very volatile, probably getting back to the numbers that we thought we would see maybe 2 or 3 years ago. It's reached a peak. Now it's coming back down again. The big challenge for the oil producers is that we're still not back to our normal consumption when it comes to fuel. The #1 thing we spend our money on fuel-wise is commuting. It's the daily commute. The daily commute on average in the United States is 30 minutes each way, 30 miles each way. So do the math. You take 300 some odd million people going to work every day. That's 300 some odd million people driving for half an hour to get there, driving half an hour to get home, 30 miles to get there, 30 miles to go home. That's 60 miles. Pretty soon you see where most of the fuel pricing is going. That hasn't come back. We're still at about 40% going back to the normal routine of work. 60% of us are still remote. And the oil producers are like, well, until that commuting level comes back up to normal, we're not going to go full bore to produce oil. We know there's a shortage now, but it's because of these political things in Europe. It's 600% increase in natural gas in Europe because the Russians are playing hardball. The Russians are refusing to ship gas, and they're refusing because they want the Europeans to do things like ignore what's happening in Ukraine and build Nord Stream 2 and a bunch of other things. And so the Russians are like, okay, if you don't do what we want you to do, no gas. And the Europeans are desperately buying gas from wherever they can get it, including the US, which has made LNG more expensive than oil. So the utilities are burning oil instead of gas. So the average guy sitting at the pump is like, you are kidding me. I am paying an extra $1.50 a gallon because the Russians are creeps. Pretty much. So like I said, I'm an old Soviet guy, so that didn't surprise me at all. For people in the economic development world, this is important. Most of the inflation measures for construction are on the way up. It is a combination of higher cost materials, but almost more than that, it's the cost of labor. The labor expenses are getting very high. It's gotten high for everybody, but where the manufacturer can offset this a little bit by going robotic and using more automation and it's hard to do that in construction. I mean, they've not yet come up with a robotic roofer. They've not yet come up with a robotic plumber. You know, this is still heavily manpower oriented, and those wages have been going up at a pretty substantial rate. So whether it's residential or non-residential or even public sector stuff, the costs are expected to continue to go up. Purchasing Managers Index has been very solid for the better part of a year. And those of you who are not familiar with the PMI, what makes this an interesting index is that it's current, comes out every month, and it's honest. Many surveys are a little fudgy because people are trying to manipulate them to a degree. They're trying to get them to say what they want them to say. But purchasing managers don't know enough to lie. So if you go to a purchasing manager and say, are you buying more or less steel? More. How come? I don't know. I don't even know what we make, man. They just told me to buy more steel and rod of toilet paper. What do you want from me? I'm the purchasing manager. I just buy stuff that other people tell me to buy. The index is also very simple. Anything over 50 is considered expansion. Anything under 50 is contraction. It has not been anywhere near contraction for over a year. I mean, it has been the lowest it got was January of last year, and it was 58.7. Any other year, that would have been considered, blistering speed. It's been in the 60s throughout. So from the standpoint of purchasing managers, and they're the people who are buying in the inventory, and they're buying in the parts, and they're buying in the machines, they're still doing a lot of work. They're still seeing a lot of expansion. And similar index, which was modeled really on the Purchasing Managers Index, and this is one I do for the National Association for Credit Managers. The credit managers are similar to purchasing managers in that they don't know enough to lie either. The purchasing manager is going to answer honestly, so will the credit manager. So we ask them questions like, are you seeing more or less accounts out for collection? More. How come? Because they're not paying us. You understand how this works, don't you? They owe us money and they're not paying on time, so they're out for collection. We divide this index into two categories, favorables and unfavorables, and there's been a real difference between the two. The favorable category, sales, applications for credit, dollar collections, and amount of credit extended. Those numbers have all been in the 60s and 70s even. So sales have been up in the 70s, amount of credit extended in the 70s. The unfavorables include disputes, bankruptcies, accounts out for collection, slow pays, customer deductions. Those have been, for the most part, in the 50s, but only barely. You get 51.2, 52, 50.3. So they're hugging that line between contraction and expansion. And some of them have fallen into the 40s. So, for example, the slow pay category has been in the 40s. It means that companies are not yet in a position to be hit with collections. They're not facing bankruptcy, but they're missing their deadlines. They had 60-day terms and they've extended it, and they had 90-day terms and they're extending it. What's interesting about credit managers is that they think into the future. They don't really care what's happening to you now. You don't owe them money now. You owe them in 60 days, 90 days, 120 days, 180 days. So they're always looking out ahead. If they're feeling confident, which they were at the end of this last month, that means they're confident about the spring into the summer because they're looking ahead at what they expect to see in terms of being paid. Just threw this in here because if any of you are still sleeping well at night, you need to stop it because we have all these global risk scenarios to deal with. The relationship with China gets worse by the day. We are dealing with social unrest in all kinds of places. I'm sure you've noticed that things are exploding in Kazakhstan now. So we're all of a sudden worried about this new Central Asian player, which is hugely significant because that's one of the main oil producers for that region and has been a pretty loyal supporter of Russia until recently. And now troops are being sent in, and the government of Kazakhstan has ordered a shoot to kill aimed at the protesters. It's going to get really nasty really soon. We have China trying to intimidate Taiwan, being active in South China Sea. The list goes on and on. So if you are in a position where you can relax at the end of the day, you're not paying attention. In my own particular case, I just watch a lot of HGTV and just try to pretend that the most important thing in the world is what color to paint the bathroom, and then I feel much better. So I'm saving the good news for last, and we'll kind of end it here and take questions. What is also happening because of the supply chain concerns and all the other issues happening internationally is that reshoring is a real thing. It's been talked about for years. It's been hoped for years. And all of a sudden, it's actually happening. We're expecting about $1 trillion coming back to the United States within the next 6 months to a year. People that are doing business in China in particular are looking at shifting, not just because the supply chain's a mess and not just because of pandemic. They're worried about the geopolitics. They don't want to get caught in some kind of political contest between the US and China, which suddenly gets ugly. The US has become much more economically nationalistic. This is the third president in a row that has been pushing that policy. So it began with some of the things that Obama did. It certainly accelerated under Trump, and it's continued to under Biden. We are paying a lot more attention to what we produce for what market. We're trying to bring semiconductor production back to the US. We are trying to bring a lot of the robotics technology back to the US so that we can be competitive internationally. 69% of companies that are doing business overseas are now stating that they are likely, very likely, or extremely likely to reshore in the future. And this has tremendous implications for economic development. It means that companies are going to be looking to either expand facilities that they have in the US, move facilities back to the US, move sourcing back to the US. The three criteria that they have continued to demand: number one, I've got to have the labor. So if I am moving back, I need to have people who can do the work and recognize that I'm coming back with robotics and automation. So that's who I need. Number two, I need transportation. I've got to be close to the highway and rail and air infrastructure to support my supply chain. And number three, I got to have willing hosts. Manufacturers are often not terribly popular in suburban neighborhoods for all kinds of obvious reasons. That's why you find a lot of manufacturers in smaller towns and more remote areas, because people look at that and say, yeah, it's going to be noisy and transportation and trucks and all that stuff, and I don't want it in my neighborhood. So as these companies start to come back to the US, they're looking for those three things to a significant degree. And with that, I will shut up and take questions. We do a lot of writing, so those of you who just can't keep enough of this, let me know. I'll be glad to put you on the trial. We've actually, those of you who are familiar with what we write, many of you are, we have for years done the Black Owl report, and we've done the business intelligence brief. I mostly write the bib, and Keith, my partner, mostly write the bore. We now have merged them, and we now call it the flagship. And so it's kind of the best of both. Most importantly, we're both writing it at the same time, and it still comes out 3 times a week. And we're now trying to make it a little bit more officer of the watch kind of brief, but try it for yourself and see what you think, and we'll go from there. Now I'm going to hush, and I think Blake is going to fire questions at me. So,
hey, Chris, it's actually Mike. Thank you so much. Terrific presentation. Great information. I think everybody is extremely appreciative, and thank you for your detailed explanation of what we're looking at for 2022. Did have a couple questions here. First question is, with the work from home craze, how is that going to impact consumer and corporate spending, in your opinion?
It's probably not going to have a huge impact on consumer spending, because the consumer is going to basically do what they've always done. In the initial months of this kind of back to work, back home type thing, there was a lot of investment in converting part of your house into an office. So you saw a lot of spending on remodeling, you saw a lot of spending on furniture, more electronics trying to be set up. Most of that has now taken place, and the consumer has done about what they expected to do. Now the question is, will they continue to spend on sort of home entertainment, or will they start to be more public. And towards the end of last year, people were going back to going out to eat and going to restaurants and movie theaters and events. That slowed down as we began to deal with the latest variant, but there are now signs that that's starting to come back too. Business spending is a whole different deal. And what's happening with business is they're trying to figure out now how much office space they really need. If they're going to have a significant part of their workforce working from home, they don't need to invest as much in office space, where they will have to invest in support for those working at home. So office development is probably going to remain slow. On the other hand, warehouse and logistics development is exploding. I mean, currently, Amazon alone is responsible for 1/3 of all the warehouse development in the United States.
Great, thank you. Next question that we had. Can you explain the term hawkish and what actions may happen? You mentioned the rate increases, but anything else to expect from the Federal Reserve, Treasury? And then there's a follow-up question once you answer that.
Very good. Hawkish is basically a term used to distinguish between those who want to see higher interest rates and those who'd rather not. So a hawk is someone like Esther George. And Esther has been pointing out for years that when the rates get this low, you have problems. You have problems when it comes to savings. Nobody can save when there's no incentive to save. She also has been very upset with the way the stock market has been influenced by low rates. People would borrow money at a very cheap rate, invest it in the market, make a lot of money, presumably, pay back the loan. What worried her is what happens if you have a correction in between those two decisions. You borrowed a lot of money, put it in the market, you didn't make a lot of money, now you can't pay back the loan, and it's the bank that's in trouble. So the hawks will then basically want to see interest rates higher than the doves. The doves are still very concerned about what it means for the growth of the economy, the labor market, etc. Frankly, there are not a lot of ultra doves right now because the unemployment rate is very low. So even those who would normally be somewhat dovish are saying, yeah, an interest rate or two is increase is not out of the question. So what it really means short term is that the Fed is backing away from all of those stimulus things that it did. It's not buying bonds like it was. It has changed the interest rate that banks get for depositing at the Fed. It's looking at the reserve ratio. The most dramatic thing that it does is raise the federal funds rate, because that's the rate that banks use to borrow from each other. And that ends up affecting the prime rate and mortgage rates and all the rest. So what you can expect going forward is the Fed tightening down, not locking it down. This is not a Paul Volcker 1980s experience. It's okay, we don't need to set things quite on fire anymore. Let's just ease back to slightly higher rates.
Thank you. The follow-up question that, taking into consideration rent costs and new home building costs in the housing market, what do you see the impact on the greater economy given the current situation, and what did we see during COVID, and what's the outlook?
Yeah, housing is probably going to stay fairly strong. The factor that was a little unusual for the last couple of years is that house prices were not affecting demand. Even though house pricing was high, people were still buying because the mortgage rates were very low. The rates are not going to go up to the point that people will be unable to buy a house if they want to, but a lot of those marginal buyers, first-time buyers, low-income buyers may be priced out because the mortgage rates will be higher and the price of homes will be higher. Part of the challenge is that two factors affect home buying. One, of course, is the mortgage rate, but the other is actually the performance of the stock market. The high-end home buyers are not as concerned about the mortgage rate as they are about their take from the stock market. And as long as the market is performing, they have money and they are using it to invest in housing. What COVID did to housing was start to shove people out of congested areas. You didn't see a lot of it around Kansas City, frankly, because we're not that congested a city. But you saw a lot of it in Chicago, LA, New York, many of the other East Coast cities, where people were like, well, In the first place, the lockdown in those cities was a lot more severe. People were not able to do much of anything. And they're like, I've been stuck in this little place for about a year. And people began to seek opportunities to work elsewhere. The remote ability to work also opened up whole neighborhoods. I was talking to the Iowa economic development people. They consider Des Moines a suburb of Chicago now, because so many people are working remotely for companies in Chicago, but they live in Des Moines. They live in other parts of Iowa because, hey, I can. And I can get a whole lot more house in Des Moines for my money than I can in Chicago. And if I'm working remotely anyway, why do I want to spend my better part of my adult life stuck on the Dan Ryan?
Yeah, very good. Thank you. Last question we've got here. I encourage anyone else, if they have questions, type them in the chat. We got Chris, and really appreciate you addressing each one of these. Last question would be that I have right now is with the continued deficit spending and the increase in national debt exponentially, thoughts on the impact long term?
Yeah, what really hits you with debt, two things. And the first of them is probably not a big problem for the US, though it has been for other countries. When your debt gets too high, like Greece experienced a few years ago and a lot of other countries do, all of a sudden you can't borrow anymore. You can't sell your bonds, and the bonds are so high priced that nobody wants them. They become junk. Lucky for the United States, maybe not so lucky for the United States, we have the most valuable treasuries on the planet. The bonds that we put up for sale always have a market. You're always going to sell them. The yields are not that bad, so we can always borrow. That's fine, except that it creates the second problem, which is debt service. Right now, the biggest problem we're dealing with is debt service. We spend $400 billion a year servicing the debt that we already have. And every time we add to that, we add to that servicing. It is now the fifth largest category of federal spending. If there's any good news at all in that increase in debt, is that most of the new debt has been purchased by the government itself. 40% of the debt that we now own is owned by the Fed and by the federal government itself. 30% is owned by US investors, 30% by foreign investors. Remember a few years ago when people were being very concerned about how much of our debt was held by China? It was something like 13%. It's now fallen to less than 5%. And it's not that they're buying any less or that they sold it off. It's just that we bought so much more that their share dropped. And so they don't have as much of a stake in the US economy as we did. 400 billion is getting close to the size of the US military budget. So every single year we are spending 400 billion that we could use for something else. So if we wanted to do infrastructure, say, or something, it's kind of like an extremely wealthy person who refuses to pay off their credit cards. It's like, okay, I understand you're fabulously wealthy. You can keep on making the payment to Visa, but why would you? Why don't you pay off the stupid card and not lose the money that you're paying to Visa? And that's kind of what we're doing as a country. It's like, quit borrowing and then having to pay the borrowing costs.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate that. Last question here. The flagship, is that formally the Black Owl Report?
It is formally the Black Owl Report and formally the Business Intelligence Brief. So it's basically the combined effort. Keith and I we're struggling each week trying to make our respective deadlines. And we kind of looked at each other over the holiday and said, this would be easier if we were both writing it at the same time. And if I get busy, then you can cover me. And if you get busy, I can cover you. One of the changes is that I'm back on the road again. And all of a sudden it's like, oh my God, I have no time to write. I'm stuck in an airport. So we just decided to be smart for once and combine our efforts.
Terrific. Thank you. Thank you so much. I know we're right at our time. I'll turn it over to Blake, but I did want to thank everyone who submitted questions. Great questions. Chris, thank you so much for addressing each one of those. And Blake, I'll turn it over to you to close us out.
Sounds good, Mike. Thank you very much. And Chris, on behalf of both of our organizations, thank you so much. That was great information. It's always good to hear from you, and thank you for being here with us today.
You're welcome.
Mike, thank you for your hospitality and for the invitation. We really appreciate getting together. And again, we're disappointed we couldn't get together in person. We'll talk more about that again. We'll have a little event coming up to try to make that up. But thank you for having us today. Ann and your staff, thank you for organizing and the invitation as well. Carol, thank you. As always, the college is always a great community partner for all of us. So thank you very much. And with that, I just want to say again to that end that we're going to try to do something to make this up. We have scheduled a date, February the 23rd, which is a Wednesday, I believe, to do a joint kind of happy hour on us. We're going to have you at the public market and invite everybody to come over and get the chance to kind of mix and mingle a little bit in person since we had to kind of go back to a year ago type protocols, and hope you can all make that. We will have a notice coming out on that here pretty soon. So we look forward to seeing you all in person. Hopefully, if this thing kind of has peaked and gone downward a little bit by then, we'll get together back in person in a little over a month. Again, thank you all for everything. I know we have a lot of joint members. It's great to see everybody kind of together, and we appreciate everybody being here today. So, Ann, Mike, everybody, thank you very much. That's all I've got. There we go. Thanks, everybody.